Honey, yoga isn't really for everyone. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back row, or better yet, the beginner class down the street. The woman who said it was standing at the front of a mirrored studio on the third floor of the Meridian Wellness Center in downtown Atlanta, a space that smelled of eucalyptus oil and the particular kind of quiet money that bought itself a view. Her name was Courtney Voss. She held a wireless microphone clipped to the collar of her linen top, and she said those words loudly enough that every one of the 23 people in that Tuesday morning class heard them clearly. She said them with a smile. That was the part that stayed in the room long after she said it. The woman she said them to was standing near the center of the studio, barefoot on a coral-colored mat, wearing a plain black tank top and fitted leggings. She had not asked for attention. She had simply arrived early, unrolled her mat in the middle of the room, and begun her warm-up in silence. Her name was Renata Osei. She was 41 years old. She said nothing in response to Courtney Voss's words. She did not look up from her mat. She simply adjusted her footing, drew one slow breath, and continued her preparation as though the air in the room had not just changed. The class watched. 23 people, and not one of them spoke. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. What Courtney Voss did not know was who she had just humiliated in front of her Tuesday morning class. She did not know what Renata Osei had spent the last 19 years building in silence, or what her name meant in rooms far more consequential than this one. And when the truth came out, it cost Courtney Voss everything she had spent a decade constructing. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Now, here's what most people did not know about Renata Osei. She had grown up in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta, in a narrow two-story house on Cascade Avenue, where her grandmother, Adaeze Osei, kept a garden in the front yard and a strict philosophy in the back of every conversation she ever had. Adaeze had come to Atlanta from Kumasi in 1971 with $40, a sewing kit, and a name that most people in her new neighborhood could not yet pronounce. She had built a seamstress business from a card table in her living room. By 1985, she owned the building. She never announced any of it. She told Renata when Renata was 9 years old and furious about something small, "You do not show people what you are building. You show them what is already built." Renata had not fully understood it then. She had understood it completely by the time she was 30. Renata had studied kinesiology at Spelman College on a partial academic scholarship and a work-study arrangement that had her mopping gymnasium floors 3 mornings a week before her 8 o'clock class. She graduated with honors and a quiet, methodical understanding of how the human body moved, how it failed, and how it recovered. She went on to complete a master's degree in exercise science at Georgia Tech, then spent 4 years working as a physical therapist assistant at Grady Memorial Hospital, where she learned what the body looked like under real pressure, not the pressure of a difficult pose in a warm studio, but the pressure of injury and limitation and the slow, painful work of reclaiming what had been lost. She had earned her first yoga certification at 26, her second at 29, her third, a 500-hour advanced certification from the Yoga Alliance, the highest credential available in the field, at 32. By 35, she held 2 additional specialty certifications, one in adaptive yoga for clients with physical disabilities, one in therapeutic yoga for trauma survivors. She had trained under practitioners in Mysore, India, and in a studio in Accra that her grandmother had helped her find through a letter written to a woman Adaeze had known 40 years before. She had published 2 peer-reviewed articles on yoga as a therapeutic intervention for chronic pain management. She had presented at 3 national wellness conferences. She had been photographed for the cover of a trade publication that served 15,000 certified yoga instructors across the country. None of this was visible when she walked into a room. She had learned that from Adaeze. You do not show people what you are building. You show them what is already built. She moved through the world with the particular stillness of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. She did not wear her credentials. She did not name drop. She did not correct people who underestimated her. She simply continued. There was one other thing about Renata Osi that was not visible when she walked into a room. For the past 3 years, she had been the lead consultant for a national wellness curriculum initiative funded by a major philanthropic foundation. The initiative was called the Meridian Project. Its purpose was to evaluate and potentially acquire a network of wellness centers in 6 major American cities and transform them into community health hubs with subsidized programming for underserved populations. The evaluation process was rigorous and confidential. The consultants who conducted it operated incognito, attending classes as regular members, assessing instructors and facilities and culture over a period of weeks. The Meridian Wellness Center in downtown Atlanta, the one with the eucalyptus smell and the 3rd-floor view, was one of 6 facilities currently under evaluation. Renata had been attending classes there for 11 days. She had paid her drop-in fees in cash. She had given her name at the front desk as Renata James, her mother's maiden name. She had a notebook in her bag and a detailed rubric on her phone and a final report due in 14 days. The Meridian Wellness Center did not know any of this. Courtney Voss did not know any of this. Nobody knew. Now, let me tell you about Courtney Voss and the world she believed she owned. Courtney Voss was 37 years old and had been the head instructor and co-owner of the Meridian Wellness Center's yoga program for 6 years. She had built something real in the narrow sense of the word. The studio was profitable. Her Tuesday and Thursday morning classes were consistently full. She had a following on social media, 42,000 followers on Instagram, a curated feed of poses and smoothie recipes and motivational captions written in a font she had paid a designer to create specifically for her brand. She drove a white Range Rover. She wore jewelry to teach. Her certifications were legitimate, though they stopped at the 200-hour level, the minimum required for independent instruction. She had never pursued the 500-hour credential. She had looked into it once, decided the coursework was excessive, and moved on. She was good at what she did, within the limits of what she had chosen to learn. That was the honest accounting of Courtney Voss. But there was something else in her, something that lived just beneath the professionalism and the polished brand, something that surfaced in small, revealing moments. A sharpness in her voice when a student modified a pose without asking, a particular coolness toward students who arrived without the right equipment, a tendency to give her warmest attention to the students who looked most like the version of wellness she was selling. She was not a cruel person in the way that cruelty announces itself. She was the subtler kind, the kind that smiles while it diminishes, the kind that frames a dismissal as concern, the kind that says honey to a grown woman who has never asked for her warmth. She had built her world carefully, and she had come to believe it was permanent. That was the error, not the cruelty. Cruelty is a symptom. The error was the certainty. The Meridian Wellness Center was owned by a holding company called Meridian Group Partners, which had been in preliminary acquisition discussions with the foundation behind the Meridian project for 4 months. The center's co-owner, a man named Douglas Farr, knew about the evaluation process in general terms. He did not know the timeline. He did not know the consultant's name. He had told Courtney Voss that the center was being considered for a major partnership, and that everyone needed to be on their best behavior. He had said this in a staff meeting 6 weeks earlier. Courtney Voss had nodded and gone back to adjusting her class schedule. She had not thought about it since. The morning Renata arrived for her 11th visit, Courtney Voss was in a particular kind of mood. The class was full, the room was warm, and she was in the middle of a demonstration when Renata moved from a seated stretch into a standing forward fold with the ease of someone for whom the movement cost nothing. It was a small thing, a fluid, unhurried transition that drew no attention from anyone except Courtney Voss, who watched it from the front of the room with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly. A narrowing, a recalibration, the look of someone who has identified something they do not want in their space. Renata did not see it. She was looking at the floor, her weight evenly distributed, her breath slow and steady. Courtney Voss walked toward her. She did not hurry. She picked up the wireless microphone from the shelf near the mirror and clipped it to her collar as she moved, which meant that when she spoke, the entire room heard every word. "Honey, yoga isn't really for everyone. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back row, or better yet, the beginner class down the street." 23 people heard it. 23 people said nothing. Renata straightened slowly. She looked at Courtney Voss with an expression that was entirely unreadable, not wounded, not angry, not amused. Still. The way a surface is still when there is significant depth beneath it. She said, in a voice that was quieter than Courtney's by several registers, "I'm fine where I am, thank you." 4 words, delivered without heat, without apology. Courtney Voss smiled the smile she had practiced. "I'm sure you are," she said. "I just want everyone to have a good experience." She turned back toward the front of the room. The class resumed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One woman near the window, a young black instructor named Simone Graves, who taught the Thursday evening restorative class and had been sitting in on Tuesday mornings to observe Courtney's sequencing, looked at Renata for a long moment, then looked at her own hands. Something moved across Simone's face. Not quite guilt. Something closer to recognition. And it was about to get worse. 15 minutes into the class, Courtney Voss called for an inversion sequence. She announced it with the particular authority of someone who uses technical language as a gate. "We're moving into our handstand prep," she said, walking through the room with her microphone. "For those of you who aren't quite there yet, and there's absolutely no shame in that, we have blocks at the back wall." She paused near Renata's mat as she said it. She did not look at Renata directly. She did not need to. The pause said everything. 3 or 4 students glanced toward Renata. One of them, a woman in her 50s named Carol Hutchins, who had been attending Courtney's class for 2 years, looked away quickly, the way people look away from something they do not want to be responsible for having seen. Renata did not move toward the blocks. She pressed her palms flat against her mat, shifted her weight forward with the precision of someone who had performed this movement 10,000 times, and lifted into a handstand. Clean, vertical, her body a single, unbroken line from her wrists to the soles of her feet, which were pressed together as though they had been placed there by a level. She did not use the wall. She did not wobble. She simply arrived at the top of the movement and stayed there, her breathing audible and measured in the sudden quiet of the room. Courtney Voss had stopped walking. The class had stopped moving. Renata held the handstand. 10 seconds, 30, a minute. The room was completely silent except for the ambient music Courtney had put on at the start of class, a low, ambient track that now seemed almost absurd in the context of what was happening. Renata's arms were straight. Her core was engaged. Her expression, what could be seen of it from below, was composed, focused, present. She was not performing. That was the thing that made it impossible to look away. She was simply doing what she knew how to do, in the body she had spent 19 years learning to understand. 2 minutes. 3. Courtney Voss had not moved from the center of the room. At 4 minutes, a man near the back of the class, a regular named Trevor Okafor, who had been attending the Tuesday class for 8 months, sat down cross-legged on his mat and watched. Not with the distracted attention of someone waiting for something to end, with the focused stillness of someone watching something rare. At 5 minutes, Carol Hutchins lowered herself to her mat as well, quietly, without drama. One by one, the class settled. Not in performance, in witness. Simone Graves, sitting near the door with her observation notebook open on her knees, had stopped writing. She was watching Renata with an expression that had moved past recognition into something more complicated. She had been teaching yoga for 4 years. She had her 300-hour certification and was working toward her 500. She knew what a 7-minute freestanding handstand meant in terms of training, discipline, and physical intelligence. She knew it the way a musician knows what it means to hear someone play a difficult passage without sheet music, without hesitation, without error. She knew exactly what she was watching, and she knew exactly what Courtney Voss had said to the woman doing it. Simone closed her notebook. She made a decision. At 7 minutes and 14 seconds, she would later be precise about this because it mattered, Renata Osei lowered herself from the handstand with the same unhurried control with which she had entered it. She placed her feet on the mat. She straightened. She took one breath. She looked at no one in particular. The room was absolutely silent. Courtney Voss was still standing in the center of the studio, her wireless microphone clipped to her collar, her class frozen around her, and for the first time in 6 years of owning that room, she had no idea what to say. Dead silence. Courtney Voss recovered the way people recover when they have no other choice. By moving forward as though nothing has happened, which is itself a kind of confession. She cleared her throat. She walked back to the front of the room. She said, in a voice that had lost some of its carrying quality, "Beautiful, everyone. Let's take a moment in child's pose." The class complied. They folded forward onto their mats with the obedience of people who needed somewhere to put their faces. Renata folded with them. She moved without comment, without triumph, without even the small satisfaction of meeting anyone's eyes. She simply returned to the floor, her forehead resting on her mat, her arms extended, her breathing slow and even and entirely her own. Simone Graves did not fold into child's pose. She sat upright near the door with her notebook closed in her lap and watched Courtney Voss move to the front of the room. And she made the second decision of that morning, which was the more consequential one. She was going to talk to someone. What Simone did not know yet was exactly who she would talk to, or what that conversation would set in motion. She knew only what she had witnessed. She knew what Courtney Voss had said, and to whom she had said it, and what the woman on the coral mat had done afterward. She knew that she had been sitting in on Tuesday morning classes for 3 weeks as part of her own professional development, which meant that she had been present as an employee of the Meridian Wellness Center, and that what she had seen was not a private matter. It was a workplace matter. It was a documented matter. She had been taking notes in that notebook since the first week of her observation. The notes were detailed. They were dated. They were signed. And now they included something that went beyond sequence and observations and instructional technique. She wrote 4 words at the bottom of that morning's page. She underlined them once. She closed the notebook. The class ended 40 minutes later. Courtney Voss led the closing meditation in a voice that was smooth and practiced and entirely controlled, and if you had not been in the room for the full hour, you would not have known that anything unusual had occurred. That was the skill she had. That was the thing she had genuinely built. She could hold a room. She could make a room feel like a sanctuary. She could do all of that, and still, in a single amplified sentence, make a woman feel like a stranger in a space she had every right to occupy. Both things were true. That was the particular tragedy of Courtney Voss. Students rolled their mats and gathered their bags and filtered out through the glass door. Several of them glanced at Renata as they passed. Not with apology, not with acknowledgement, with the careful, sun-long attention of people who are not sure what they have just seen or what it requires of them, or whether they are willing to find out. Carol Hutchins, the woman in her 50s who had been attending for 2 years, paused near the door. She looked at Renata for a moment that was slightly too long to be accidental, and then she walked out without speaking. The door swung closed behind her. Renata rolled her mat with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. She tucked it under her arm. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Simone Graves was standing in the hallway. "Excuse me," Simone said. Her voice was quiet. She was holding her notebook against her chest with both hands, and her posture had the particular tension of someone who has decided to do something they know will cost them. She was 28 years old. She had been teaching at the Meridian Wellness Center for 2 years, and in those 2 years she had watched Courtney Voss manage the studio with a kind of authority that did not invite challenge. She had watched it and said nothing because she needed the job, and because she had told herself that the things she noticed were small things, and that small things did not require action. She had told herself that right up until this morning. "I want you to know," Simone said, "that I'm going to report what happened in there. I don't know who you are. I want you to know that someone saw it." Renata looked at her. The same still expression, the same unreadable depth. Then something shifted, very slightly, at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile exactly. Something older and quieter than a smile. "I know you did," Renata said. "Thank you, Simone." She said Simone's name as though she already knew it. Simone watched her walk down the hallway toward the elevator, and she stood there for a long moment after Renata had gone, turning that over in her mind. She had not introduced herself. There was no name tag on her shirt, and the woman on the coral mat had thanked her by name, without surprise, without explanation, as though she had been expected. Simone opened her notebook. She read the 4 words she had written at the bottom of the page. She went to find Douglas Farr. Now, here's what most people did not know about the Meridian Project. The foundation behind it was not a small operation. It was the Hartwell Family Foundation, endowed in 1998 by the estate of a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who had spent 30 years as a public health administrator in Atlanta and had left behind a trust worth $240 million with a single directive: to make preventive health care accessible to communities that the market had decided were not worth serving. The foundation had funded community health centers, mobile clinics, nutrition programs in Title I schools, and now this, a wellness initiative that would take 6 existing centers in 6 cities and transform them into something the market had never built on purpose. The budget for the acquisition and renovation phase alone was $62 million. The evaluation process that Renata Osei had been conducting for the past 11 days was the final gate before that money moved. Renata was not merely a consultant on the Meridian project. She was its director. She had been appointed to that role 3 years earlier, after 2 years of building the evaluation framework herself, from a methodology she had developed during her graduate research at Georgia Tech. The Foundation's board had chosen her not because she was the most prominent name in the wellness field. She was not prominent in the way that generates attention, but because she was the most rigorous, because her framework was the most thorough instrument anyone had ever brought to the question of what a community wellness center actually needed to be, because she had spent 4 years at Grady Memorial watching what happened to bodies that had never had access to preventive care, and she had built her entire professional life around the question of how to change that. The Foundation's executive director, a man named James Okafor, no relation to Trevor, the class regular, had told the board when he recommended Renata for the role, "She's the most qualified person in this country to do this work, and she will do it without anyone knowing she is doing it, which is the only way it can be done honestly." He had been right on both counts. The evaluation rubric that Renata carried on her phone covered 47 distinct criteria across 6 domains: physical accessibility, instructional quality, staff culture, community responsiveness, pricing equity, and what the framework called environmental dignity, the degree to which a space communicated, through its design and its practices and its human interactions, that everybody that walked through the door was equally welcome. Renata had developed that last domain herself. She had argued for it against 2 board members who thought it was too subjective to measure. She had shown them the methodology. They had voted unanimously to include it. Environmental dignity, the degree to which a space communicated that everybody was equally welcome. She had been scoring the Meridian Wellness Center against that criterion for 11 days. She had been patient. She had been thorough. She had given the space every opportunity to demonstrate what it was capable of. She had watched the front desk staff. She had watched the locker room dynamics. She had watched how the Thursday evening class handled a student who arrived in a wheelchair, and how the front desk handled a student who asked about sliding scale pricing, and how the Tuesday morning class handled a woman who showed up on a coral mat in a plain black tank top and did not look like the version of wellness being sold on the wall. She had her answer now. She had had it since the moment Courtney Voss clipped the microphone to her collar. The report was due in 14 days. Renata had enough material to write it in 2, but she was not a person who moved on incomplete information, and she was not a person who let one incident, however clarifying, substitute for the full picture. She would finish the evaluation. She would attend every remaining session. She would score every criterion against every piece of evidence she had collected. She would write the report with the same rigor she brought to everything. And then she would submit it to the Hartwell Foundation Board, and the board would make its decision, and the decision would be binding. That was the process. That was the discipline. That was what Adeyeza Ose had meant when she said, "You do not show people what you are building. You show them what is already built." Renata rode the elevator down from the third floor of the Meridian Wellness Center and walked out into the morning air of downtown Atlanta, which smelled of exhaust and coffee and the particular quality of sunlight that arrives in Georgia in late October. Warm still, but with an edge to it, a reminder that the warmth is borrowed. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She took one breath. She took out her phone. She opened the evaluation rubric and navigated to the domain marked environmental dignity. She found the criterion she was looking for. She entered her score. She did not linger over it. She put her phone in her bag and walked to her car. Simone Graves, meanwhile, had knocked on the door of Douglas Farr's office on the second floor and had been told by his assistant that he was on a call and would be available in 20 minutes. She had said she would wait. She sat in the chair outside his office with her notebook in her lap and her hands flat on the cover of it, and she waited with the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is no longer afraid of it. She was still afraid. But the decision was made, and the fear was now beside the point. Douglas Farr came out of his office 19 minutes later. He was 53 years old, a compact, careful man with the manner of someone who had spent his career managing the distance between what things were and what they needed to appear to be. He had co-owned the Meridian Wellness Center for 8 years. He had built it into something that made money and had a reputation and attracted the kind of clientele that other businesses in the neighborhood used as a benchmark. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had allowed the culture of his business to be shaped by its most visible personality, and who had told himself that the results justified the delegation. He had told himself this for 6 years. Simone stood up when he came out. She said, "I need to talk to you about something that happened in the Tuesday morning class." Douglas Farr looked at her. He had known Simone for 2 years. He knew her as a reliable instructor, a careful professional, someone who did not come to his office with small complaints. He opened his door wider and gestured for her to come in. She sat down across from his desk. She opened her notebook. She told him, in precise and sequential order, exactly what she had witnessed. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She read from her notes where the notes were relevant, and she spoke from memory where they were not, and when she was finished she placed the notebook on his desk and said, "I wrote it down as it happened. The date and time are on the page." Douglas Farr sat with that for a long moment. He was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are recalibrating, when the thing they have been told requires them to revise something they had preferred not to examine. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Simone. He said, carefully, "Was there a name for the student?" Simone said. "She gave her name at the front desk as Renata James." Douglas Farr nodded slowly. He picked up the notebook. He read it. He set it down. He said, "Thank you for bringing this to me." His voice was even and measured, but something behind his eyes had shifted, and Simone recognized it as the particular quality of a man who has just understood that a problem he thought was theoretical has become, without warning, entirely real. He did not know yet how real. He would know by morning. The reckoning did not arrive with noise. It never does when it is real. It arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the Tuesday class, in the form of a phone call to Douglas Farr's office from a woman named Patricia Osai Hartwell, the executive administrator of the Hartwell Family Foundation, and, by a coincidence that was not a coincidence at all, Renata Osei's first cousin on her father's side. Patricia did not call to report anything. She called to confirm that the evaluation period for the Atlanta site was concluding ahead of schedule, that the director's final report had been submitted to the board the previous evening, and that the board had scheduled an emergency session for the following Monday to review its findings. She used the word emergency with the particular calm of someone for whom that word carries institutional weight rather than personal alarm. She asked Douglas Farr to make himself and his co-owner available by phone at 9 o'clock Monday morning. Douglas Farr said yes. He said it the way a man says yes, when he already understands that the conversation has moved beyond the point where his answer matters. He hung up the phone. He sat for a long moment in his office, which smelled of wood polish and the faint, stale sweetness of the protein bars he kept in his desk drawer. He thought about the notebook Simone Graves had placed on his desk 2 days earlier. He thought about the name she had given him, Renata James, and about the call he had made that same afternoon to the Foundation's intake office, identifying himself as the center's co-owner and asking carefully whether there was any active evaluation in progress at his facility. The intake coordinator had paused for 3 seconds before saying she was not able to confirm or deny the details of any ongoing assessment. 3 seconds. He had counted them. He had understood what they meant. He called Courtney Voss into his office that Thursday afternoon. He closed the door. He told her what he knew, which was enough. He told her about Simone's report. He told her about the Foundation's call. He told her that the evaluation director had been present in her Tuesday morning class. He told her what the evaluation covered, and he said the words environmental dignity, with the careful pronunciation of someone who has recently learned a phrase and understands that it is going to cost him. Courtney Voss listened. She sat across from him in the same chair Simone had occupied 2 days before, and she listened with the expression of someone who is waiting for the part where they are told it is not as bad as it sounds. That part did not come. When Douglas finished, she said, "She should have told us who she was." Her voice was steady. Her jaw was set. She said it as though it were an argument, as though the disclosure of the observer's identity was the variable that would have changed the behavior, rather than the behavior itself being the variable that had always mattered. Douglas Farr looked at her for a long moment. He said, quietly, "That's not how it works, Courtney." She left his office without responding. She walked back to the third-floor studio. She stood in the center of it, in the room that smelled of eucalyptus and the particular quiet money that had bought itself a view, and she looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall. The room was empty. The coral mat was gone. The Hartwell Foundation board met on Monday morning. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Renata's report was 112 pages. It covered all 6 evaluation sites across 6 cities. The Atlanta site scores were detailed across all 47 criteria. 31 criteria were scored satisfactorily or above. 16 were not. The environmental dignity domain contained the lowest aggregate score of any site in the evaluation. The board voted 7-1 to exclude the Meridian Wellness Center from the acquisition and partnership program. The dissenting vote was from a board member who thought the center deserved a remediation period. The other 7 disagreed. The decision was final. The Foundation's executive director, James Okafor, sent a formal letter to Douglas Farr that same Monday afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs. It was specific. It cited the evaluation findings without naming the director. It cited the incident of Tuesday the 14th as documented by a staff member in a contemporaneous written record. It did not use the word discrimination. It did not need to. The letter said what the facts said, and the facts were sufficient. Douglas Farr read the letter twice, then called his attorney. The following Friday, Courtney Voss was removed as head instructor and co-owner of the Meridian Wellness Center's yoga program. The terms of her departure were negotiated over 3 days and involved a buyout of her ownership stake at a valuation that had declined considerably since Monday's letter arrived. She signed the agreement in a conference room on the second floor of a building she would not enter again. She did not make a statement. Her Instagram account went quiet for 11 days. When she returned to it, the posts were different, quieter, less certain, stripped of the particular authority she had carried in her voice when she said "honey" to a woman on a coral mat. Whether that change was genuine or strategic, only Courtney Voss could say. The narrator does not know her heart. The narrator only knows her actions, and her actions had spoken first. The $62 million went to the other 5 sites. One of them was in Chicago. One was in Houston. One was in New Orleans, and that one, the foundation decided, would be named in honor of Eleanor Hartwell's original vision, a community health hub in a neighborhood that the market had decided was not worth serving, offering subsidized programming and sliding scale pricing, and a front door that communicated, without ambiguity, that everybody that walked through it was equally welcome. Simone Graves was offered a position as lead instructor at the Chicago site. The offer included a full scholarship toward her 500-hour certification, funded by the Foundation's professional development grant. She accepted it. She called her mother from the parking lot of the Meridian Wellness Center on her last day, standing beside her car in the October air, and she cried with the particular relief of someone who has spent a long time waiting to find out whether doing the right thing would be worth it. It was worth it. It had always been worth it. She had simply needed the evidence. Trevor Okafor, the man who had sat cross-legged on his mat and watched, found out 3 weeks later, through the quiet channels by which Atlanta tells its own stories, who Renata James had actually been. He told his wife that evening. His wife said, "I knew there was something about her." He said he had known too, in the way you know something without having the words for it, in the way that truth announces itself before you have the language to receive it. Renata Osei drove back to the West End on the afternoon the board's decision was finalized. She parked in front of the narrow 2-story house on Cascade Avenue. The garden in the front yard was still there, smaller now, tended more slowly, but still there, with the particular persistence of things that have been cared for over decades. Adaize Osei was 81 years old and sat on the front porch in the late afternoon light with a glass of water and the unhurried posture of someone who has outlasted most of the things that once seemed urgent. Renata sat beside her. They did not speak for a while. The air smelled of soil and late-season flowers and the particular warmth of Georgia October, borrowed and brief. Then Renata told her grandmother what had happened. Not the injury of it, but the completion of it. The work, the report, the decision, the outcome. She told it the way Adaize had taught her to tell things, plainly, in sequence, without embellishment. Adaize listened. When Renata finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You showed them what was already built." Not a question. A recognition. Renata nodded once. She looked at the garden. She did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say. The work had spoken. The work always speaks when you give it the time and the silence it requires. Now. Here's the thing I want you to hold when you leave this story. What happened to Renata Osei in that third-floor studio happens every day. Not always with a wireless microphone, not always in front of 23 witnesses. Sometimes it happens in a boardroom, or a hospital corridor, or a parking lot, or a classroom, or a lobby where a person is asked to prove they belong before they are allowed to enter. It happens to people who have built extraordinary things in silence, who move through the world without announcing what they carry, who have been taught by their grandmothers and their fathers and their elders that the building is done quietly, and the proof arrives in its own time. It happens to people who have every credential, every qualification, every right to be exactly where they are, and who are still asked by someone holding a microphone whether they might be more comfortable somewhere else. The question is not whether Renata deserved what came to her in the end. She did. The question is what it cost her to get there. The question is what it costs every person who has to carry their worth invisibly because the world has not yet learned to see it. The question is what we lose, collectively, every time someone with a microphone and a certainty they have not earned decides who belongs in the room. Dignity is not a credential. It does not require a 500-hour certification. It does not have to be demonstrated in a 7-minute handstand. It simply is. And the people who forget that tend to find out the hard way. If this story made you think of someone you know, someone who carries more than the world gives them credit for, drop a comment and tell me about them. I want to hear it. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe. Every week, we find the people the world overlooked. We tell their stories until the world can no longer look away.